Hello, everybody. Now we're starting. So my name is Liz Reed. I'm the head of adult services here at the Morrill Memorial Library in Norwood. First things first, if you haven't already silenced your cell phones, please do so now. If you need a restroom, it's out past the reference desk and on your right-hand side, and we do have some water at the front of the room in the bubbler up here. Thank you so much for joining us at the final installment of the Stuart Plumer Memorial Author Series. Many of you have come to a number of presentations this year, and we've had really an amazing slate of authors come join us here in Norwood, which is amazing. The series was put together in memory of Stuart Plumer, who was a trustee here for decades. Many of the things that people say they love about our library are because of Stuart Plumer. So his family and friends gathered to fund together at his passing, and that's what brought our author series to us this year. And joining us along the route at every single author event was Aesop's Fable. So round of applause for them because they've come to every single time. And so tonight we are here to listen to Stephen Puleo, to talk about the Voyage of Mercy, the USS Jamestown, the Irish famine, and the remarkable story of America's first humanitarian mission. Since you're here for this event, I assume you might like author talks. We do have a few virtual author talks coming up. And if you're here because you're interested in Irish history and culture, we have an Irish music concert coming up mid-December. It's a Saturday concert, daytime with Jeff Snow, who we've had before. Registration just opened for that today, and that is a Gathering of Celtic and Christmas concert. So sign up, there's room right now. So tonight, we are joined by Stephen Puleo. He's an author, historian, teacher, public speaker, and communications professional. He has published 7 narrative history books, including Voyage of Mercy, Dark Tide, A Caning, The Boston Italians, and A City So Grand. He's been a guest speaker at the National Archives and the National Constitution Center, a keynote speaker for the 150th anniversary celebration of the Massachusetts Superior Court, and a panel participant with Italian American and Jewish American scholars entitled Italy and the Holocaust. And that was presented at UMass Boston. He has appeared on C-SPAN, the History Channel, and numerous regional and national radio and television programs, a former award-winning newspaper reporter and contributor of articles and book reviews to publications and organizations that include American History Magazine, Politico, the Boston Globe, and the Bill of Rights Institute. Puleo has also taught history at Suffolk University and at UMass Boston. His 8th book, which I am personally very much looking forward to, The Great Abolitionist, Charles Sumner and the Fight for a More Perfect Union, will be out in April of 2024. So join NCM, join the Morrill Memorial Library, and welcoming Stephen Puleo.
She's turning on the mic, so. Thanks, Liz. I appreciate the wonderful introduction. You guys, I was noticing tonight as you were filing in, this is my 664th appearance as an author. So over my 20-year author span, 664. I do keep track of them kind of obsessively. And as you were walking in, I'm thinking this. I've been to a lot of these, obviously. These are hard to do. They're hard to put together when I say hard to do. So they're tough to organize, they're tough to publicize. You always hope for a good crowd, but you're never sure. Liz will tell you that. Independent bookstore people will tell you that. So to see a group like this on a cold Wednesday night or chilly Wednesday night really means a lot. It really does. So I appreciate it. You're here to hear about a book, and you're here to hear about nonfiction and history. And look at this, we have a great crowd. So thank you for being here. It really, really means a lot to me personally. I have a few things to say, obviously, and then at the end of this, I want to get to your questions and your answers. When we get to Q&A, for me, it's my favorite part of this whole thing. And anything is on the table. We could talk about the topic at hand, we could talk about books, publishing, etc. Feel free. Writing, I get a lot of writing process questions. That's open as well. So it's an informal kind of a thing. Don't be shy. I don't sense that this is a shy group. I've met a few of you. So feel free to do that at the end as well. And finally, just wanted to let you know, please support your independent bookstores. I know we already had the commercial for Aesop's Fables, but any other independents. I love all bookstores. Listen, I love Barnes & Noble. I do. But when you get a good independent bookstore, this is in Holliston, please do your best to support it. It's not too far away. You can get out of the greater Norwood area and go ahead and shop there. I think that would be great to do that. So tonight, Voyage of Mercy. I always talk about this book in this context. I feel like it's a story of soaring goodwill, amazing generosity amidst the most unfathomable despair. There's two parts to this story, two sides to this story that take place on either side of the ocean. One is the Irish famine, and when I talk about the Irish famine, it's with a capital T, a capital I, and a capital F. The Irish famine of 1846 and 47, often called the Great Hunger by people from Irish. How many people in this room might have some Irish heritage in their blood? Yes, everybody. So it makes perfect sense. In this part of Boston, we're right in we're in some of the most Irish zip codes in the entire country. I'm from Weymouth, by the way, which has more Irish descent people than Norwood does. Abington has more than Weymouth. Situate has more than practically anybody. So yes, we're in that kind of an area. And so we have that going on, the Great Hunger, the Irish called it, and I distinguish it because Ireland had many, many famines leading up to the Great Famine. Destitution in Ireland. So we had famines in 1800, 1818, 1820, 1822, 1830, 1831, 1833, 1835. Kind of mini famines that lead up to this one catastrophic famine, the Great Irish Famine, the hunger. Black 47 is sometimes the Irish called it, because most of the dying takes place in 1847. On the other side of the ocean is the extraordinary, unprecedented American response to this famine. The subtitle of the book is the remarkable story of America's first humanitarian mission. That indeed is the case. It's really not just America's first humanitarian mission. It's the world's first humanitarian mission. This notion that the people of one country would help the people of another country was something that just wasn't done in this period of time. Countries went to war with each other. Countries ravaged each other's cities and burned each other's crops. Every once in a while they traded with each other. But this notion, this altruistic humanitarian aid, just to help them for the sake of helping people of one country to the people of another, never happened before this 1847 mission that started with the USS Jamestown. So those are the two stories that we have going on here on each side of the Atlantic. When you read the book, some of you have the book, I see, but when you read the book, you'll see that's how it sets up narrative-wise. So I go, I'm in the US, I'm in Ireland. I'm in the US, I'm in Ireland in different chapters because it seems to lay out that way. It seemed like a natural way to put the book together. So when we talk about the Irish famine, there's many aspects to this. There's much folklore about it. There are some facts about it. But it really is such a linchpin and such an important part of Irish history. The Irish famine is really the underpinning of almost all of Irish history that follows. The Irish independence movement in the 1920s has the famine at its root. The Second World War, when the Irish refused to join the British and their fight against the Nazis, even when the British are standing alone in 1940 and early 1941, the De Valera government says no. Ireland is one of 6 or 7 neutral countries during the Second World War. Switzerland, Spain, Yemen, a couple others. Becomes a real problem. We'll talk a little bit more about this. Becomes a real problem for the Irish after December 7th, 1941, because that is America's war too. And the Irish have a very strong relationship with the United States. But we'll talk about that. The troubles in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, all have as their root, the background, the famine, and the way the British handled the Irish famine, which is to say, almost not at all. Almost not at all. Certainly not well. Callously, neglectfully, but certainly not. And so all of that is part of Irish history. Now, the British-Irish issues, which are usually largely Protestant Catholic issues, were going on well before the famine. We're talking the mid-1600s. William of Orange, 1695, the penal codes that forbid Catholics from what? Owning property, going to school, going to work, living in certain sections, etc., etc., etc. All of that anti-Catholicism was part of the Irish experience well before the famine. But the famine becomes the symbol of complete British abandonment of Ireland. And the Irish remember it for a very, very long time in 1999, just before the turn of this century. Irish historian said, the Irish famine has been the unseen guest at every Irish dinner table for 150 years. And I think that's correct. I don't throw out a lot of numbers during my presentations, but I just need you to keep a couple in your mind when we talk about the extent of this famine, right? So the population of Ireland is about 9 million people pre-famine, about 9 million. Post-famine, about 6 million, 3 million people, 1/3 of the country, disappear during the famine. And of that 3 million, about 1.3-ish, 1.4-ish die of starvation or diseases attendant to starvation. Dysentery, typhus, scurvy. The other 1.6, 1.7 emigrate. The great Irish diaspora. The Irish go many, many different places. They go to other parts of Europe. They go to other places within the British Empire, though reluctantly. Some go to Australia, a few go to India. Some go to Canada, but they want to get out of there because it's still part of the British Empire. Most come to the United States. Even those that go to Canada, by the way, often it was cheaper to go from Ireland to Canada than it was to go from Ireland to New York City or Boston or Philadelphia or Baltimore. So what would normally happen is the Irish immigrant would take a boat across to Halifax and then take a second boat down to Boston. They were referred to as two boaters. You may have two boaters in your family. Most Irish families have two boaters. Those who went to Canada because it was cheaper, but wanted to get out from under the British Empire, of which Canada was a part during the famine. So sometime in the summer of 1846, the Irish potato crop fails almost across the country. Starts in Cork, more to the south, spreads across the country very, very quickly. A fungus infects these potato plants at a time when about 30% of the Irish population relies almost exclusively on the potato. 30%, almost exclusively on the potato. The potato was a food crop. If you had a great harvest, it was a cash crop. So you could sell your excess potatoes, buy a pig, buy a cart, buy a farm implement. It was the essence of life to the Irish people, vitality. What good is a nation that relies on potatoes? Asked British bureaucrat Charles Trevelyan, who was responsible for managing things during the famine. What are we going to do with these Irish? They depend on the potato too much. What Trevelyan never said is that most of the tenant farmers that worked these small plots of land did not own their land. They worked for absentee British landlords. And during the course of the anti-Catholic laws that were put into place over the years, the slices of that land grew narrower and narrower and narrower, so that one of the only crops that produced enough yield to feed a family with 4 kids or 6 kids or 8 kids, and the Irish birth rate was growing prior to the famine, was the potato. 3 times the yield of corn, for example. And it wasn't the Irish are well-versed in food science, but they learned quickly that the potato contained almost everything they needed. Had vitamins, had protein, had minerals, had iron, had calories. Hello, very important, had calories in the midst of potential starvation. Here's the downside to the potato. You can't really cure it, salt it, keep it till the next year. The harvest one year fed you and you hope for another good harvest. 2 bad harvests in a row was a disaster. Periods during June, July, August, in between the planting and the harvesting, when the Irish had almost nothing to eat. These Irish peasants, almost nothing to eat. It's hard for us to wrap our arms around that now. So when the crop fails in August of 1846, by about September, October, starvation is already underway in Ireland. Just a few months, it happens fast. By Christmas time, by December of 46 and into January of 47, in one of the worst winters in Irish history, snow, blizzards, wind, cold, ice, everything you can imagine in a winter. Many Irish peasants are evicted from their homes owned by British landlords because they can't pay their rent, usually potatoes, they could use that, take that to market to pay their rent. They couldn't pay their rent and they were evicted. So you had literally thousands of starving Irish farm workers, peasants, wandering the countryside. Their homes torn down around them. When I say homes, I'm talking like hovels, mud huts, cabins, etc. Some of them with hardly any clothing or just what's on their backs. Literally, the sheriff would tear down the house around them. The word eviction becomes part of the Irish lexicon. It becomes a dirty word in the Irish lexicon. Even when the Irish come to the United States, the word eviction needs to be avoided at all costs. It's one of the reasons why the Irish work so hard to purchase their own homes when they first get here. It's very, very difficult for you to be evicted from your own home, from something that you own. So that's happening during December and January. Into January of 1847. Hundreds of thousands of Irishmen have starved by the new year. Hundreds of thousands more would during 1847. And one of the images seared into the kind of the long-term folklore and visuals of the Irish people are, as they're walking the countrysides after they've been evicted with nothing to eat, carts would go by filled with other grains that the British would be guarded by British troops that the British would be exporting so that their corn markets would not be disrupted. Seared in the memory of the Irish people. One of the images during this time. You have a situation in Ireland that is wholly catastrophic, and you have a response by the British that is wholly inadequate. They do very, very little for almost all of 1846. And into January and February of 1847, there's lots of dithering about setting up soup kitchens. Lots of bureaucracy. Pages and pages of who would be eligible for soup kitchens. How long they could stay in the kitchen. How do we get rid of one group of people so another group of people could come in? Page after page of that, I've seen them. But not a single bowl of soup is served until almost April of 1847, when it's almost far too late. The British have problems with Ireland. They believe they are too Catholic. They believe they rely too much on religion. They believe they need to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. They believe they rely too much on the potato. It's 1846 for crying out loud in London. It's the Industrial Revolution. What do you mean we have people who rely totally on the potato? That was the attitude of almost every British bureaucrat during this period of time. Parliament and the Crown and other state bureaucrats. I'm asked often at these presentations, is the way the British handled the famine, would you equate that to a genocide? And I say that I don't, because as you guys know, the word genocide is almost literally created in 1947, about 100 years later, to describe the Holocaust. And the UN defines it as a state-sponsored effort to exterminate a people based on religion and race. And I don't see that here. There was a period of time when a lot of Irish writers, I would say right after the Second World War, from about 1947 or 48, all the way up to about 1980, a large group of Irish writers were calling it a genocide. I think around 1980 that changes. And it's kind of where I'm at, which is that this British response was incompetent, inept, based on inertia, callousness, anti-Catholicism, all of those things, but not a deliberate genocide. But still, so poorly handled. And I think even most British historians agree with that now. On the other side of the ocean, in the United States, the US, people in the US, Catholic parishes in the US, have gotten word about some of the issues in Ireland. But outside of the Catholic parishes, there's a little bit of a boy who cried wolf feeling in the United States. These Irish folks, they've talked about these kinds of famines before, we've contributed money before. How bad can it possibly be? In January, late January of 1847, some of the first ships come after it's still wintertime, but they're able to come across the ocean. And in Boston and New York, two ships land, one in Boston, one in New York, and word gets out very quickly at how bad things are in Ireland. And the American people, starting here in Boston, respond pretty quickly. Robert Bennett Forbes, who's a Boston ship captain, one of the main characters in this book that I'll talk about in a minute. Boston ship captain organizes a meeting at Faneuil Hall in February, early February of 1847, for a decision on what can we do to help the Irish? What should we do to help the Irish? What's our obligation? Do we have an obligation? Thousands, almost 5,000 people are in that Faneuil Hall area for this meeting. It's a huge turnout. Forbes and a couple other prominent Bostonians meet with the congressman, Robert Winthrop at the time, and say, we could do a couple things. Number one, can we ask Congress for money, to contribute money to Ireland? That might be one way we can go. And number two, Forbes says, listen, I'm a ship captain. I'm a ship builder. I know everything there is about ships. I've logged more time at sea than almost any man of my generation, which was true. I will volunteer to take a warship, an old warship that isn't being used, retrofit it, and help collect foodstuffs for Ireland. Direct food aid, something in addition to money. All Congress has to do is grant me the okay. Turn that ship over to me, we'll remove the cannon, and we'll get it done. Winthrop puts this before Congress in late February. Things move very fast, by the way. In late February, there's huge debates in Congress on how we would help the Irish. First, a proposal for $500,000 to contribute to Ireland. Lots of debate. Why are we doing this? Why aren't the British doing it? What will the British think if we do this? History's funny this way. We are in discussion with the British right now for Oregon territory. We want that. We want Oregon as part of the United States. It's British territory in 1847. If we contribute to the Irish, how are the Brits going to feel about that? Is that going to disrupt negotiations for Oregon territory? That's part of what's going on. President Polk weighs in and says, look, I know you guys are having this debate, but I'm just telling you, if this bill comes on my desk, I'm going to veto it. Because I don't think it's constitutional for us to send aid, to send United States government money to a foreign country. So the 500,000 goes by the boards. However, Congress does approve 2 warships to be turned over to civilian captains. First time that's ever happened. It hasn't happened since. The USS Jamestown here in Boston, the USS Macedonian in New York City. The Macedonian gets all wrapped up in bureaucratic red tape. Jamestown moves very, very fast. The other thing Congress does is this, and some of the government leaders, some of your big name senators, Daniel Webster, John C. Calhoun, Henry Clay, Polk himself. Congress decides concurrently with turning over the ships, decides to kind of act as a recommending body. And government officials recommended and urged that municipalities in the United States form Irish relief committees and do their best to collect food to send to Ireland. As often as you could, direct aid was better than money. It would get to the people faster, to the people who need it. Yes, there were some financial contributions, but direct food would be better. And lo and behold, almost every single municipality in the United States does this. Big cities like Boston and New York, frontier towns all the way out to the west, which was about the Mississippi at the time, the rural area of Detroit in Michigan, almost nobody's out there. They contribute. Steubenville, Ohio contributes foodstuffs along the Ohio River. Almost every single municipality sets up a Relief for Ireland committee and sends food. They put food, they cure it, they dry it, they put it in burlap sacks, they put it in kegs. They send it on small boats along the Ohio River, along the Erie Canal to the East Coast. People who run those boats do it for free. And they take them to the big cities and the big ports where they're loaded onto large ships to help this effort. The Jamestown is the first boat to go on March 28th, 1847. That's it, 2 months after we get word of how bad things are. And the Jamestown was the first of 150 American ships that would be sent over the next 16 months till about July 4th of 1848, loaded down with foodstuffs. It was an astonishing response by the American people. It had never happened before, ever. First time. And it set the tone for the way the United States does its charitable giving, the model for the way the United States does its charitable giving up till this day. And that is this kind of public-private partnership. The government contributes money, the people contribute more. Oftentimes you will see these statistics that say the United States does not give as much money per capita to international humanitarian causes as other countries. I would urge you to beware of that statistic. It's not true. Those stats are almost totally based on government contributions, not private contributions. And in the United States, look at it this way. In 2019 was which was the last year that this aggregate was done. The United States contributed about $120 billion to international humanitarian causes. This is not to be confused with defense spending, military spending. This is humanitarian causes. 120 billion. About $50 billion of that was spent by the United States government. By the way, that is to say, you, the taxpayers. But 70 billion of that, 70 billion of that came from you through private donations, charities, NGOs, whatever you contribute through. You know, Catholic Charities, Combined Jewish Philanthropies, the International Red Cross. Listen, you've already started getting these envelopes in your mail now for this time of year. Tons of them. And there'll be more over the next 3 weeks, all the way to the second week in December. All of those is what I'm talking about. Those are all private organizations seeking donations for one charity or another. The American people are very generous people. So keep that in mind as you kind of hear these stats sometime. That model starts in 1847 with the Jamestown mission and carries all the way through. It carried in 1906 when the American people sent food and medical supplies to the victims of the earthquake in Messina, Sicily. In 1917, when the explosion in Halifax, Nova Scotia, in the harbor occurs, kills people, glass injuries, Boston, doctors, nurses, and people send medical supplies, food, everything you can imagine. Within hours, Halifax still acknowledges that by donating a Christmas tree to the city of Boston. Just before the United States enters World War I, the Hoover Commission feeds millions of starving Belgians who are blockaded by the Nazis, by the Germans. America is still a neutral country in 1915 and 16 when this happens. Herbert Hoover raises millions of dollars for food to save these Belgians. In 1948, in one of the most amazing charitable humanitarian efforts of all time, America feeds millions of starving Berliners with the Berlin airlift after the Soviets encircled Berlin. A plane taking off and landing every 60 seconds in Berlin with food and supplies, the so-called candy bombers. Many of those planes dropped candy for children, German children, people that the United States was at war with 3 years earlier. It continues all the way up to the Chilean miners. Remember the Chilean miners trapped in 2010? It was American private technology that was sent down there to get those miners out. That whole charitable model starts with this mission in 1847. I'm pointing to my book here, in case you're wondering where I'm pointing. It starts with this mission in 1847, that public-private assistance to others. And it starts this whole notion of providing humanitarian aid between other countries too. As I said, this notion of doing it just wasn't part of the geopolitical landscape then. What made the United States do it, do you think? This little window in which almost everybody, no matter their race, no matter their religion, no matter their occupation, no matter their geographic location, contributes to this effort that the American people put together to help on. What causes it? So when you write history and you research history and you put these things together, right, there's hardly ever a document in a sealed envelope that says on the outside, Here's why America did this, like a secret document. You don't come across those too often. You have to do a little conjecture based on the documents, always based on the documents. But you have to do a little conjecture. So here's my, what I would call educated conjecture on a number of things that come together, a confluence of events that come together that caused the American people to be so generous in Ireland's worst, darkest time. One, particularly true in the Northeast, and I think particularly true with progressives in the Northeast. There's a great deal of guilt about the Mexican War, right? 1845. The annexation of Mexico. Many progressives in the Northeast see it as an excuse to, by the South, to expand slavery. In many cases it was, in many ways it was. This was one way to assuage some of that guilt. Listen, here's what we're doing to Mexico. Not good. Let's do something good for Ireland. That's one. Second, we're in the midst, 1846, 47, 48, of a number of reform movements that are underway. Education reform, mental health reform, prison reform. Women's suffrage movement just getting its legs under it at this time. A little early for most of it, but getting its legs under it. Abolitionist movement, getting its legs under it, really becomes militant after 1850, but in this time is getting its legs under it. This is, I think, an extension of, listen, we're trying to do all of these good things. Let's try to do something for these people who need it. 3, 1847 is right smack in the middle of the second great American reawakening. About 100 years after the first reawakening. Led mostly by the Protestant churches. I'll save you 2,000 pages of reading on the second great reawakening. It basically says this, that you don't need clergy members and church elders to tell you what to do in order to get into heaven. Just do good works and you'll get there. Second great American reawakening. The involvement by the Protestant churches in this effort, 1847, was enormous. The Quakers, enormous. The Quakers actually organized most of these efforts from time to time. So that's part of it. And then the last piece that I think comes together in this window, and maybe the most important piece of all, 1846 is the first time in American history when the words manifest destiny was used. You might remember manifest destiny from high school, do you? Remember the phrase at least? So, manifest destiny. People were going west. The year of decision, 1846. People pulling up stakes, heading westward. Now, manifest destiny gets a bad rap in many ways, and it deserves some of it. Mistreatment of Native Americans, gobbling up land, in some cases, the environment, the buffalo, all of that is part of manifest destiny. However, manifest destiny also has some virtuous parts to it, as almost all things do, have both. One of the tenets of manifest destiny says this: America is a country with millions of acres of arable land. Miles and miles and miles of navigable rivers that allow us to move goods all across our country. Astonishing. Coastlines teeming with fish. We have an obligation to help people less fortunate than us. That's a tenet of manifest destiny too. And I think that comes into play. So I think all of those factors enter into the United States decision to help Ireland during this time. And what it also does, by the way, this effort, the same way that the famine really caused bitterness and rancor between the Irish and the British, that I think starts to diminish a little bit at the turn of this century, but not totally, maybe not even totally now. I tell a little anecdote. In 2009, my wife, myself, and several members of my wife's family, by the way, big Irish family I married into, just so you know. But anyway, we went to Ireland, and the trip started in the south. We went up to the north, to Belfast, and wonderful time. But we had one of those big open vans, with the roof. I forget what you call them, but there's a name for them. You know what I mean? You could see everything, and a nice driver. And so we went to the north, and we came out of our hotel in Northern Ireland, and the driver's side window was smashed. 2009. Our driver immediately says, they saw the southern license plate. They right away knew it. So just a little anecdote, but 2009, I'm saying to you that it was still there. And it may still be there today. That World War II issue, think about this. So, Churchill extends his hand to Ireland and says, can you help us? The Nazis are killing us. The Germans are pummeling us. The de Valera government says no. In some cases, offered sanctuary to Nazi leaders to come there. Would not allow British ships trying to escape Nazi U-boats to tuck themselves into Clare Island or anything of the sort. So would not allow that. However, about 60 to 70,000 Irish, many of them members of the Irish Defence Force, essentially defect and join the British Army. They joined the British Army. A couple of them received medals on D-Day, by the way. And these members who defected did so because they did not agree with their government's position. They did not agree with their government's position. And particularly after December 7th, Americans are our friends. How can we turn our backs on them? But these folks, about 12,000 of them come back to Ireland at the end of the war. They are not allowed to have government jobs. Some of them are prosecuted. They're fearful of being prosecuted for years and years and years. They are finally pardoned in 2012. 2012. So when you talk about, history's long arm, long reach, that whole World War II piece is worth a book in itself. I'm not doing it. It's not I'm just saying, it's worth a book in itself, that whole British, Irish, American relations. And the other thing this mission did is really solidify and strengthen, till the present moment, the relationship between the United States and Ireland. There's no question about it. Those bonds are very, very strong. Sure, because so many Irish came to the United States. But it goes beyond that. They remembered when the Jamestown arrived in Cork in April of 1847. It was a huge emotional moment. They knew the Jamestown was coming with food. And on the Jamestown's arrival in Cork Harbor, there are bonfires up on the hillside. There are lamps in the cabins lit. It's a very emotional celebration. And when Robert Bennett Forbes, who's the captain that makes all this happen, starts it all on this side of the ocean, gets there, he meets the other important character in this book, the other main character in this book, a Catholic priest named Father Theobald Matthew. Father Matthew, the people's priest. The people's priest. He's a priest who respected peasants. He was respectful to poverty, one of his superiors once said. He did confessions at 5 a.m. and 11 p.m. because many of his parishioners worked in the fields, couldn't get there otherwise. He learned Gaelic because some of the people in the countryside even when they came into Cork City, where he was based for Mass, couldn't understand English. So sometimes you would hear confessions in Gaelic. In the 1830s, he worked to help Irish people who suffered from the cholera epidemics. Worked in the fever sheds, rolled up his sleeves and worked beside them, comforted the sick, did all of that. Becomes world famous, by the way, without leaving Ireland, when he gets hundreds of thousands of Irishmen in the 1830s and early 1840s to sign an anti-drinking pledge, a temperance pledge. Becomes world famous, is known as the Apostle of Temperance at the time. By the way, he eventually comes to the United States, does it here for the Irish who have come here. And in the 1840s, during the famine, he does the same kind of things, works in the fever sheds, tries to give money when he can to starving Irish, lets Irish people stay in his home, and finally opens an Irish Catholic cemetery at his parish to bury the dead from the famine. He is worshipped in Ireland and in Cork. There's a statue to him in Cork right now. That was put up there in 1864. So I think when you read about both Forbes and Matthew, singular, you'll find them to be pretty interesting people, pretty noble heroes on both sides of the ocean. And when they met, when the Jamestown gets to Cork, they shake hands. It's this reverential moment, I would call it, for the Irish. Father Matthew is the savior they know. Robert Bennett Forbes is the savior from across the sea who's bringing food and foodstuffs to Ireland. One more small thing, and then I'll get to your questions. The other thing this episode in history did was solidify the Irish close-knitness with the Native American community. Indians. In 1847, the Choctaw tribe, they are the tribe that was part of the Trail of Tears from Mississippi, Louisiana, all the way over to Oklahoma. In 1831, 16 years prior to the famine. Many of them died on the way. They contribute in 1847 $170 to the Irish people and send it to Ireland. That begins this long relationship that continues to right now. In 1995, Mary Robinson, who was the president of Ireland, becomes a member of the Choctaw Senior Council, the first woman to be named. And in the pandemic that we just got done with, the people of Ireland contributed money to both the Choctaw Nation and the Navajo Nation. So right up until this moment, some of those bonds that were forged remain. Pretty incredible. So with that, I'll say thank you, take some water, and then take your questions in that order. Thank you very much. And I'll repeat these questions. So if you don't hear one, if I do, you will. So you don't have to strain. So we'll start with the lady in the front, but I won't forget people in the back.
How did Captain Forbes get the cargo of food past the British who control the ports?
Yeah, so how did Forbes, it's a great question. I love that question, which is kind of in general like the larger question. Her direct question was, how did he get the food past the British who controlled the forts? The larger question is, what do the British think of all this effort? What is this? So don't be thinking that the British were deliberately blockading the Irish ports. They were not. Their reaction to the American effort, I would say, was mostly ambivalence. So some of the political concerns that American congressmen had, American senators had, did not come to fruition. Now, I think some of that was a little bit of embarrassment on the part of the British, particularly on the part of the Queen Victoria, who issues very, I would say, a couple tepid statements that say, oh, please help the Irish, but doesn't really get too involved. So I think some of it's that embarrassment, and I think the other part of it is, I don't think Britain wants any kind of war or, conflict with the United States at that point. So don't be thinking that they're blocking the ports. They definitely allow these 150 ships over 16 months to come in, and their reaction, I would say, is very, almost non-existent, but there's not much confrontation at all. And it doesn't, by the way, obviously, case in point, de facto, affect Oregon negotiations. We do get Oregon. It is a state. Yes, so that's, even though those are underway, it doesn't affect that either. But I love the question. Thank you for asking it. Yes. What else? Yes.
So in Milton, the Forbes Museum
Yes.
has a wonderful display of everything that you're talking about, pictures and things like that. And it's just, I was wondering if you had used any of their.
Yeah. So the question is the Forbes Museum in Milton. That's up on the hill. Great view. Yes, is Robert Bennett Forbes builds that for his wife in 1833. Robert Bennett Forbes is, by the way, one of these characters who you could make a Hollywood movie out of him. Millionaire before he's 30, loses it all, gets it all back. It's incredible. But yes, he builds that house. They have a steering wheel from the Jamestown in that house. They have a couple other things. But for me, research-wise, one of the really big finds very late in my writing process was, so Forbes and his wife lost a couple of children right after they were married. They had a difficult time. They lost 2 children. They finally were able to have one. And he makes reference in the letters that he writes to his wife when he's at sea a lot, that he had written the dates of their deaths in the Bible, in his Bible. So Forbes's papers are all at the Mass Historical Society. He writes hundreds of letters. They're great. Log books. He does a big report on this mission, all of that. But I couldn't find his Bible. So I was kind of writing around the loss of the kids. Couldn't quite pinpoint the date. So very late in the process, the Forbes house calls me and says, guess what? Underneath a big armoire, in the corner, tucked in the corner in the dust, we moved it to do some painting. There's the Forbes Bible. And so there it is in the front sheet of the Bible when the death dates of the kids. And so I was able to actually use that in the book. I rewrote quick, actually contacted my editor and said, I need that back for a second. So yes, but yeah, Forbes House is great. If you I've spoken there a couple times. I'll be speaking there in the Great Abolitionists. They're good friends of mine. So, but if you have a chance, go there. It's really worth it. It's a nice take. It's not open, it's one of those places that's open certain hours on certain days. Yeah, so you have to check, but I think it's worth going to. Yeah. Yeah, of course. What else? What else we got, question-wise? Yes, sir.
Do you have other people that help you do the extensive research that you do?
So I would say 90% of the extensive research, as you say. I had my niece help me on my last 3 books prior to that, and my book that's coming out in April, I had a friend's daughter, she's now a junior at Harvard, who's helped me with some of the research. So I do like to have that. First of all, I like to give the opportunity to the kids, but second of all, it's helpful to do a few things, but most of the research is mine, and of course all the responsibility is mine. So the famous, all errors are my responsibility is correct. Yes. So, yeah.
How do you decide which topics to write about?
How do I decide what topics to write about? So I think I like to combine a few things, right? So number one, I like if it's an incident or an episode, it has to have some drama to it, right? So I write narrative history. History is very interesting. You are not required to read boring history, by the way, ever. You are not required to. And so I like there to be some drama to it. I like the episode. If it's an episode, there has to be some kind of big ramification of that, that means something beyond the episode itself. So that's part of it. There has to be compelling characters, and in nonfiction, when we talk about characters, they're real life characters. So I can't make them up, but I like them to be compelling. And so one of the ways you know that they're compelling is, probably the most important thing is, you have to have good, solid primary sources. And so all of my books rest on this. When you read my bibliographic essay in this book, it's 30 pages long. I expect you to read it, just so you know, like, come on, man, take the time and read it. It's like, it's like I write narrative history, so you always have to have those kind of sources to kind of preempt anybody saying, hey, are you making that up? This reads like a novel. I'm not bragging that my book reads like a novel, even though I think it does. I'm saying that a lot of people will say that your style, that's how this reads, like fiction, but it isn't. And so that's why you have to rest it on these primary sources. And so I try to put all that together, and then it has to interest me. Like, I'm with this thing for 3 years. So like, if it's gonna bore me, I think it will bore you. So all that kind of comes into how I make that decision. Yeah. And I have, of course, a file that says future books. It's not, there's no mystery to what's in the file. Like, if you broke into my computer, you'd see, here's some ideas. But yeah, so, yeah. Yes?
So you knew about the famine before you started writing?
I did, yeah.
And then after you wrote about it and did all this research, did it change how you thought about it?
Yeah, so I knew about the famine, and then I did all this research. Did it change? So a couple things. One, I knew a lot about the famine. I did. My Irish family that I moved into, I've done a little genealogical research for my father-in-law, my late father-in-law's side of the family. So I've always been interested in that Irish experience. I did tons of research on the Italians, my people. I did research on the Irish in a city so grand, which is when the Irish lived in the North End during the 1850s, 60s, etc. So always interested in the topic. Learned much more about the famine. Learned, I think, kind of was able to put into place this kind of British response to it. However, knew nothing about the American response beyond the Jamestown. So I knew about the Jamestown. I had seen it
I
in...
have your attention. With Janet Shaughnessy, please stop at the circulation desk on your way out. Thank you.
Janet, will you do that? No. So yes, I did. What I didn't know was the American response beyond the Jamestown. Knew about the Jamestown, knew about Forbes a little bit, but this 149 ships that follow the Jamestown, this widespread American response kind of floored me. And as I'm going through the documents and as I'm going through the reports, and the Quakers reports that all of these outside all these towns from around the country send in, I was like, wow, I think I might have something good here, you know? So there's scholarly works on the famine that, if you're really interested in the famine, you should probably also read. You know, I'm just saying, there are people who dedicate themselves, they are famine scholars. I don't pretend to be one of those. I think I know a lot about it, and I think this book will give you a good sense of it. But the other part of this book, this American response, has never been told before. So I'm very excited about that part, you know? Yeah. Great question. Yes, sir.
My English is very short, so, but I understand, okay, your explanation. So, you try to explain, okay, the difference there is between the contribution of the government and the contribution of the people.
Correct. Yep.
But there is a principle in the economical principle of the United States, because we have two theories, the Friedman theories and the Galbraith theories.
Yeah.
It is the problem of yesterday, it's the problem of today, and it will be the problem of tomorrow.
So what's the problem that you're saying?
Okay, the contribution of the government.
Yep.
And the contribution of the people.
Yes.
And you like, okay, to say that this is a principle, economics principle in the United States.
Yes.
By your research, are you something that you are going to modify or something.
I don't think so. I think so. You're asking if that sort of public-private.
Yes, ma'am, because my English is very short.
Yeah,
yes.
no. So I think if you're saying the public-private partnership, is that something we should modify? I would say no. I think it works. I think it works in almost every endeavor. And I think it's like an important thing that in many cases distinguishes the United States from other countries. Yeah, I do. So, yeah. So I guess one of the ways I look at that is, you know, when the country's founded in 1776, this whole notion of all men are created equal, which is an aspiration, but an important aspiration at a time, think about this, when you are almost totally defined by your parents' station in life. Almost everywhere else in the world, without exception, you were here if your father was here, and that's all you would ever be. So this public-private partnership that I'm talking about is an extension of that notion that you can, you know, to coin a cliche, be almost anything you want to be, regardless of when you were born, where you were born, and who your father is. So that's what I would say. Yeah. Does that answer your help? Does that answer your question? I want to make sure I'm answering your question right.
Excuse me?
I want to make sure that I'm answering. Is that a good
Yes,
answer?
yes, that's okay.
Good. Okay. Good. Yes.
Are you
Excellent.
Estonian though?
What's that?
Are you Estonian? Too?
Am I Italian? Yes.
Historian.
Oh, a historian. Yes. I'm an Italian historian. No. Yes, I am. Thank you. Yes. Yes, sir. Yeah.
So, you're talking about the genocide, just to.
Yeah.
to
Just that notion. Yeah.
So, you know, the aspect of total lack of empathy, concern, really not.
All of that.
Right. But I've read, and I've just wondered if you have studied this part of it, maybe it's not even true, but I have read that many of the absentee lords and Brits as well were sort of happy to get rid of all these tenant farmers,
Yeah.
and weren't too concerned about a number of deaths, so that there were less poor that they had to be concerned about as being oppressors in the country.
Yeah. Yes.
So if I could just say, that puts it for me, not as a genocide, but a little bit more than but lack of empathy. There's some reason why they didn't help beyond, or is that not?
No. I think the callousness that you're referring to, which is in some cases where people died, it was, well, okay, good, we don't have as many people to take care of. Yeah, I think there was some of that. But I also want to emphasize this. There were some absentee landlords who did their best to help in those situations. There always is, right, in these kinds of cases. They're the exception, I think, to the rule. I think you probably have the rule right.
But
Yeah.
I meant more than that.
Okay.
I meant that there was the implication that they therefore didn't help because they were happy to have rid of this problem, and that might have influenced
Yeah.
them. in
So
less-
I will tell you this, okay, we're done. No, I will tell you this, that in my research,
Yeah, that's right.
90% of it is what I would call almost utter incompetence and ambivalence towards the Irish people. Not what you're suggesting, which is let's let them die so we can, you know, it's the old Dickens line, let's let the poor people die so we don't have to crowd the poorhouses or whatever it is in A Christmas Carol.
You didn't see
I didn't see that, but I did see like some shocking incompetence, you know, like, oh my God, you gotta be kidding me. Like you wanted to shake Trevelyan by the lapels, and I talk a little bit about it in here. But that's what I see more of, you know? Yeah, no, it's great. Yeah, yes, sir.
Because this had never been done before, how mapped out was it on both sides of the ocean in order to make sure that it was handled well when all this food got to Ireland?
Yeah, so how did it get handled, especially in Ireland, I think?
I mean, how did they know 150 more ships were coming?
Yeah, they didn't.
And not rioting about the first ship showing up.
Right. So the first ship that shows the Jamestown, word kind of gets out that there are more ships to follow. The Irish kind of know that. However, your point's well taken. Your question's a good one. There's debate, a lot of debate on how the food is going to get distributed. So how do we do this properly? Father Matthew, for example, wanted all of the food distributed only to Cork City, none to the countryside. Because the Boston people said they want their foodstuffs to go to Cork, County Cork. Father Matthew says, let's just do it at Cork City because all the people who come in from the countryside anyway, because there's no food out there, they look in the city. There are other pastors from around the countryside who say, no, it should be the opposite. It's the people of the countryside who have it the worst, so they should get more. Then there are other pastors from outside of Cork who say to Robert Bennett Forbes, hey, can we have some of that? Forbes says, nope. The Boston people wanted to Cork only. By the way, that was true of the designations were true of almost every place in the United States. So the people of Steubenville, Ohio, that I mentioned, all their stuff they wanted to go to. I think it was County Killarney, I believe, because they had people in their town from there. So there were these designations on where it should all go. So there was a lot of confusion. Finally, in the Cork one, in the Jamestown cases, what they ended up doing was almost literally dividing the county up into a grid, 160 squares. So Cork City would be several of those squares, and dividing it equally up. That's what they ended up doing. Other places, what they would end up doing is these ships would come into the harbors, Dublin, Londonderry, any of the harbors, Sligo, and because Ireland had a terrible system of internal roads, still not great now, but terrible at the time, what they would often do is from the interior, a group of 10, 20 young men usually would go down to the harbor and kind of drag the food back, So not totally scientific, but they do come up with I talk about in the book how they distribute it in, and by the way, I can't believe you haven't read the book yet. You're my brother-in-law. He is, in full disclosure, can you believe that? So yes, I do talk a lot about it, and thank you. Excellent question. Yes, sir.
Okay, so I was born in England of Irish parents, and I was encouraged to learn about my heritage all my life and the history of Ireland and whatever, listen to good old rebel music.
Yeah, of course.
And obviously never to trust the British. And so now I'm an English teacher. I'm lucky enough to be able to teach an Irish literature course. And part of that course, I try and teach a little sort of condensed Irish history. So I do the typical, O'Connell, De Valera, Parnell, Adams, whatever. But I must admit, I had never heard of Theobald Matthew.
Huh.
Why isn't he more famous? Is it because we like our heroes to be flawed characters and he sounds almost perfect, too good to be true?
Well, it's an interesting point. He is almost too good to be true, but everything I read about him, all the research I did on him, he is too good to be true. I don't see much wrong with him in the way he sacrifices of himself in his dedication to his parishioners. So I suppose that could be one reason why, but lots of these stories fall through the cracks for one reason. You know this, you're a teacher, right? So lots of these stories fall through the cracks for one reason or another. I'm often asked about the molasses flood, my molasses flood book, Doc Todd, hey, how come there wasn't a book on that? It just happens sometimes in history. I think that sometimes history is not taught the way it should be. Some of the great drama often gets taken out of history. Listen, I have lots of discussions with history teachers. I speak to a lot of history teachers, and I love teachers. I was married to a teacher. I am married to a person who was a teacher. Let me say that properly. Yes, I am married to someone who was a teacher. So I love teachers, but oftentimes history, I think of almost all of the subject, history is taught the poorest, if I can say that. Lots of drama is taken out. Lots of the personality. There is nothing more interesting than history. Nothing more interesting than history. And, that's the opposite of what a lot of people think. I have people come up to me who say, I've read one of your books, it's the first nonfiction book I've read in 30 years. I really liked it, I can't believe it. And it's because they went through this teaching of history that was dull and dry and dusty. And I once had a meeting, I'll tell you the story. I once had a meeting with textbook publishers. They said, can you guys look at, there was 3 big ones, McDougall, Littell, I forget the other 2. They're broken up now, but they were these 3 big textbook publishers. Houghton Mifflin was one of them. And they said, can you take a look at this high school history textbook and teacher textbook? Tell us what you think. I said, sure, US history. So I go through it, and then we go into this room. There's like, 20 people around this table, 20 of these publishers, and these aren't stupid people. They're smart people. And they said, what do you think? I said, look, you have this history textbook that has what I call a very soft narrative. Like, let's take US history. It's like, okay, Abraham Lincoln, freed the slaves, did this, so there's nothing that kind of grabs the kids that says, hey, hold on a second. Every 20 years, 25 books come out about Abraham Lincoln. It's amazing. It's astonishing what an influential person he was. He's more important than the Gadsden Purchase. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's nothing wrong with the Gadsden Purchase, but you got to stop these people and grab them by the lapels and say, this is why this is important. And I don't think that happens enough. One of my favorite stories, so Teddy Roosevelt, who I'm a big fan of. So Teddy Roosevelt, same thing, soft narrative. He's Rough Riders, environmentalist, San Juan Hill, president, like that. I'm reading it along as I'm kind of falling asleep. But here's the story of Teddy that's not in there. In 1912, he's running. He's already been president. He comes back. He's running as a third-party candidate against Taft and Woodrow Wilson, part of the Bull Moose Party. He's about to give a major speech in Milwaukee, and he's got a big sheaf of paper. Here's the speech in his chest pocket. He's on his way to the amphitheater, and he gets shot. Bullet goes through the sheaf of papers into his chest. And his entourage is around me. We got to get you to the hospital. Teddy says, no, I have a speech to give. Goes to the amphitheater, 5,000 people in the amphitheater, right? No microphones. And he says to the crowd, listen, I've just been shot. I'd appreciate you keeping side conversations to a minimum during my speech. He proceeds to discard one blood-stained page after another, finishes the speech, turns around and says, okay, now I'll go to the hospital. He gets to the hospital. Teddy prided himself on working out, has these big chest muscles. The doctors say, you know what, it's kind of deep, a little bit dangerous to do surgery. We're just going to leave it in there. And they do. And he dies 8 years later of natural causes. So I say to these textbook publishers, why isn't that in the Teddy Roosevelt part of the story? Did you know that story? Yeah, some people did, some people don't. But so why isn't that in the text, in the story? And he said, listen, go to the back of the textbook, the teacher's textbook. There's like this big, huge list of advisors, like 150 names of people who are advisors. He said more than anything else, like the history becomes kind of political. So, liberals have this opinion of things, conservatives have this opinion of things, and so we have to take a lot of stuff out because of these both sides, and so we end up with a little bit of vanilla in our history. And so it's a shame, right? It's just stick with the sources and put that stuff in. You can interpret things, let people know it's your interpretation. You can ask the students to interpret it, but stick with the sources. And I said that to these guys and gals, and it was like, yeah, Steve, you're right. Why isn't that Teddy Roosevelt story in there? It should be. And so I think you missed a lot of that, you being this group, you, in high school or college or wherever you did this. And so I would say there's lots of great narrative history out there. Read as much as you can. Besides me, read me, but I'm saying besides me, there's lots of good history out there that I think you'd enjoy. So that's my long answer. So, yeah. So.
Do you have a comment you're willing to make in public about the idea that we now seem to be judging people by today's standards and now taking people that have been held up as good people in our history, whether it's Jefferson or
Yeah.
others, and we had a debate in Boston about Peter Faneuil. And the idea that we're judging people maybe by our standards and not by the standards by which they lived. And
Yeah.
they probably judged the people before them as being savages.
I think so.
I wonder how we're gonna be judged 100 years from now.
Yeah, so that point is well taken. I'm not a big fan of tearing down statues. I think you need to, if you're going to, let's just use that as an example. If you're going to remove a statue, know why you're doing it and make sure it's done in some kind of logical way. So would I want a statue of Jefferson Davis in my town? Probably not. Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy whose goal was to sustain slavery. However, is Jefferson Davis different than having a monument over here to Confederate grunt soldiers? I think it is. I think that's a different thing that you could say those guys weren't part of the overall, philosophical underpinning of that. They gave their lives. I also believe in making sure you know the history. My example I use is this. There was a statue of Abraham Lincoln in Park Square where a black man was kneeling in front of him. That scene depicts an actual, accurate scene in Richmond. Lincoln visits Richmond on April 4th, 5th of 1865, just a week before he dies. And the Confederates have left, and most of the white people have left. He is greeted almost exclusively by blacks, former slaves, several of them who get down on their knees and say, "You are the Messiah. Thank you, you are the Messiah." And Lincoln says, quote unquote, "Get up off your knees, you never have to bow to anyone again." So we removed that statue from Park Square, and we removed it because the person who wanted it removed said, "Listen, I walked by the statue and I saw a black dude kneeling to a white dude. I didn't like it." Gets a petition going, that's a direct quote. Gets a petition going, they take the statue out of there. My point is, put a plaque up there that says what this depicts. Like know your history, learn your history. So I don't like that idea. And to your point about 100 years from now, yes, they will be tearing down our statues for various reasons that we can't even contemplate. We can't even contemplate. One of the examples I use, and those of you who know people who've had cancer or medical issues. So let's say 100 years from now, there's some kind of wand, ultraviolet, the same thing that dentists use to set resin in their teeth, whatever. And you can wand somebody, find out what their cancer is, and you can cure it without these invasive procedures. Let's just say it's 100 years from now, right? 150 years from now. Use your imagination, right? We're talking about 300 years ago when they put leeches on you to bleed you. So I'm just saying, put that in your head. Is there going to be somebody who says, we need to take that doctor's name off the medical school because you know what he did? You know what this oncologist did in 2023? He demanded that his patients come in, every 2 weeks, where he pumped them full of poison that not only killed their cancer cells, but actually destroyed their good cells, their immune cells. Can you believe the barbarity of it? By the way, that's called chemotherapy. Happens every single time, thousands of times in the United States. What a barbarian he was. He can't be on our medical school oncology. Let's get him off. If you think that's a far-fetched thing, think again. It is not. So I am concerned about the standards of today and being applied to the times then, which is not to say there aren't. Like I said, I don't want Jefferson Davis's statue in my town. And the other point I would say is, if you're going to take it down, do it in some kind of logical way where people get in a room like this and vote on it and talk about it, and somebody knows what they're talking about. But yeah, so that's how I feel about it. I feel very strongly about it, and it's a concern of mine. So, does that answer your question? I certainly hope so. I'm exhausted. No.
I was talking about the other Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, the slaveholder, and yet what did he do? In the sum total of his life.
Yes,
was for the good.
that's exactly right. I think you have to take the body of work into consideration and know the context of the times. Yes, I do. I do think that. Yes. So here's another example. I'll just give you guys this. I teach a World War II class. I've taught it at Suffolk. I've taught it at UMass Boston. And it's a course that takes you from 1939 to 1945, all the way to the end, right? So we discuss the dropping of the atomic bomb. You know, was it justified? Was it good? Was it? So I say to my kids all the time, listen, we can discuss this, but what you can't do is blame or ascribe to Harry Truman things he didn't know. So here's what he knew. Extremely powerful bomb that would kill a lot of people, and also believed that it would save hundreds of thousands of United States lives on an invasion of Japan. He did know that. What he did not know is that the half-life of radiation is like 75 years or 80 years. He did not know that. Oppenheimer did not know that. They knew there was a half-life of some sort, but he did not know that. So you can't use that in your analysis of whether Harry Truman's decision was the right one. You have to put yourself in the moment. You have to. Otherwise, you're doing a grave disservice, I think, to yourself, to the people around you, to history in general. So I think put yourself in that moment. That's what I say. That's what you get. Okay, listen, thank you guys. Awesome.